Everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Scuttlebutt for Monday, June 17th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. And with me, as always, is co-pilot and Executive Director of the VBC, Todd DiPastino. Todd, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Hello, everyone.
And also joining us is our intern, Henry Shepke. I've seen him pop on and off as his internet may be a little shoddy there in Madison, so I don't see you now, Henry. We'll see you soon. But I'm seeing some familiar faces out here in the Zoom room. Ed Cottrell, always great to see you, World War II veteran. Larry Woods, I haven't seen you in a while. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Chad Riddle, Rick, Ben, always a pleasure, and everybody else. And if you are new to this Monday night Zoom program, we are the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're stationed here in Western PA, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. And we are made possible by generous donations and by you all joining us here now. And we invite you to donate to the VBC by visiting our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. On there, you can check out everything that we have to offer, from veterans interviews to past events to upcoming in-person breakfasts to our blog. We'll get to all of that a little later with our station break. And I want to wish everybody here a belated Happy Father's Day. If you have kids out there, Happy Father's Day. We're going to talk a bit about that as we have a special guest, Brian Ahearn, with us. Brian, did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, you did.
Excellent. You're not a veteran.
No, my father served in the Corps from 1962 to 1969, including a combat tour in Vietnam, I think about 13 months.
We're going to dive into all of that, and I have your book here. I just finished it the other day. Boy, what it really made me reflect not only on my parenting, though I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, but it really made me really reflect on my relationship with my dad, because my dad comes from probably just the tail end of your dad's generation, but seemed very similar in a lot of odd ways, though he is not a veteran. And also that Todd and I are both also not veterans. So we're interested tonight in the story of your dad, the story of his service, and especially the story of a father that you had a very tumultuous up and down relationship with, but a relationship nonetheless, which some people can't say.
Yeah, my relationship with my dad started off with admiration. I mean, when I was a little kid, and my parents had both my sister and I when they were very young. I think my dad was 23 when I was born. And so as a 7-year-old living in California, watching him play football on the beach, I just thought, man, I mean, he was only a few years removed from service. And I distinctly remember some college guys saying, man, you should try out for the Los Angeles Rams. And you can imagine how proud I was as a 7-year-old who was just getting into football and things like that. And I even remember as I don't know, maybe 10, 11 years old thinking, man, I wonder why dad doesn't run for president, because he was incredibly intelligent. And as you might imagine, being a Marine, he was a captain in the Marines. He just took charge of everything he did. And he had a strong opinion about everything too. So there was a lot of admiration from me as a youngster growing up.
He had a presence about him. I've noticed that about Marines.
He did. In fact, at his funeral, his brother Rory said, when my dad walked in a room, you knew it. I mean, he was just one of those people that just naturally drew people to himself. He had traveled the world, spoke a lot of languages, just, again, very intelligent on like geopolitics and just about everything. And so, yeah, you definitely felt his presence when he was around.
I say presence. I see Brad Washabaugh in the room. He's a fellow Marine. And happy birthday, Brad, by the way. But I've asked Brad to adopt me because he has such a presence, and the guy just doesn't stop. And I'm like, man, if I had like a percentage of your motivation, oh boy, I could.
And Brad said no. Brad rejected
he said no.
you.
He straight up no. He's like, no,
real nice,
I got
Brad.
too much. I got stuff to do.
Yeah,
no.
I got kids. I don't need another one.
But we love Brad. Brad, happy birthday. Glad you're joining us. Brian, you mentioned your dad was very intelligent, and that was something that sort of ran in the family.
Education in the Ahearn family, a high premium on education. So my grandfather was a professor at a number of schools, including Cornell, Baruch College in New York, and several others. And he was really hard on his boys. So to give some context for everybody who's listening, Irish Catholic family, dad born in 1941. Growing up in that Irish Catholic, going to church, altar boy, all that kind of stuff. But his dad was really hard on the boys, and my father was the second of six, and he said that when his older brother Corny, who ultimately became an attorney, if he got a 95 on a test, his father was like, "Why the hell didn't you get 100? You're an Ahearn." And so there was a high premium on education. But the funny thing was, my father didn't take school serious at all. In fact, he went to Iona Prep in New Rochelle and graduated 121st out of 123. And because of the conflict with his father and something he overheard, he turned that around and routinely made the dean's list in college. And I think at that point, when he realized that he was actually very intelligent, that became a huge part of his personality and what people knew about him.
Did your grandfather serve?
He did not. And there's a brief mention of that in the book. And I think it really got under my father's skin because truthfully, there was a lot of conflict between he and his father. And I think a lot of my dad's life, he was trying to just say, up yours and I'll show you. And it did spur him on to do some great things. But he was mentioned in an email about looking for a letter from his mom that my grandmother had written to all their children about why their father hadn't served. And I think my dad just looked at it and thought, you were a coward.
How did your father come to serve?
I think he started contemplating it out of high school because his grades weren't good. His mom had to beg the dean at Fairfield College, now Fairfield University, to give him a shot. And so what spurred my father on was he went down into New York City to have lunch with his father, and he was sitting outside his office talking to his secretary, and he overheard somebody say, "How's your son doing?" And my grandfather, named Cornelius said, he just graduated. He's going to Fairfield. He won't last 6 months. Then he's off to the Marines.
Wow.
And he literally, and what's interesting about the book, firsthand account where my dad wrote in his own words about that whole incident and said that the secretary that he was talking to was crying because she was so upset for him. And but that was the kick in the pants that was like, you know what, I'm going to show you. And then again, he went off to college and did really well. And then I think it shocked his father that he still decided he was going to go into the Marines. And he wrote about that. He said, I don't think he'd fully grown up, even though he was then married to my mother. He and his friends weren't ready to kind of give up the life of being in college. And he thought, let's join the Marines. We'll go kick some ass and raise some hell. They had no idea what they were getting into. And those couple of friends ultimately got discharges. And my dad found himself in Vietnam without his two buddies.
Crazy. And your mother or your grandmother, I think there was thoughts that she had about your dad joining the Marine Corps.
She had always hoped one of her boys was going to be a priest. So being the Irish Catholic family, they really were hoping that one of those boys would go into the priesthood. There wasn't, my father loved and adored his mother. I mean, he literally wrote, she was the best thing about our lives. And his father being alcoholic, she's the one who kept all the boys on the straight and narrow and things. He didn't specifically talk about what her thoughts were of him going into the Marines. But what was interesting about his father was when he got sent over to Vietnam, according to my Uncle Rory, his father quit cold turkey while he was away in Vietnam. And I really think that, he, even though there was all that conflict with his father, I think that his father really was looking up to heaven and saying, please, Lord, let him come home safely. But as soon as he got home, the drinking returned, and so did the strife between my father and his dad.
Why do you think your grandfather was an alcoholic?
Yeah, my father wrote about saying that he thought it was a crutch and compensation, and they came over. They were early Catholics, in the early 1900s, and they had to really struggle. My dad wrote, they were kind of the Latinos of the time. They weren't just graciously accepted like we do Irish people now at this point, but so education became a big thing for them. But I could have been the stress of having all those kids. There were 6 boys and a girl. There were 2 other pregnancies that ended in miscarriages. Back then, he's the only guy working because grandma's staying home. I think there was some pressure there, but I think there was also just alcoholism in the family, because of the 6 boys, 4 of them ended up in AA, and thank God they ended up getting sober, and then the sister ended up in AA too. So there was definitely something running through the family.
And he was very close with his siblings.
Yeah, but it's interesting that his brother Kevin, when Kevin and I have talked about his time in Vietnam, and Kevin went and applied to get in the Corps, and a skin issue or disease or something like that prevented him, and so he didn't end up serving. And he always felt like that was kind of a bridge, or I should say a gap between those two. I found out a lot later in life that the things that my dad finally started opening up and talking to me about and wrote about, he wasn't talking to anybody else except his wife, Jo, and some other Marines, because I shared stories with his brother, Kevin, who was only about a year and a half younger. And Kevin had no idea about many of the things that I shared that my dad had either told me or he'd written down.
You mentioned his wife, Jo, but this was his second wife, correct?
Yes. So my mom, Ann, they were married for 20 years, but it was very tumultuous. Almost half of that time, they were not together. Now, some of that meant, some of that was because he was over in Vietnam. And then even when he finished, she had come back to the States and was living with my grandmother, with my sister and I. But then there was years of separation, like when they were in California for 4 years, 2 of those years they were separated. When we moved here to Ohio, the last few years of their marriage, they were separated. So it was a very tumultuous relationship for sure.
And what year did he go to Vietnam?
He was in the Corps 62 to 69. So he was over there in 65 into early 66. And so I was, well, I was going to say, I was born in Hawaii because he was stationed at Kaneohe. And so I was born in Tripler Army Hospital in 64.
And when he went over, where was he stationed in Vietnam?
Phu Bai and Da Nang were the 2 spots that he mentioned. And let me give context for the people who are listening too when I talk about my dad writing. When I started writing this book, what makes it, I think, unique is that because I'd been pressing my dad to try to understand him better, about 10 years before he passed away, he'd been sitting and writing about his time in the Corps and Vietnam and other things. It was just cathartic for him, and I think was helping him process things. And he gave me the document and he said, here, maybe this will answer some questions. Maybe it'll raise some more. We can talk about it next time we're together. So much of what I'm telling you is firsthand account from Dad as he sat down and wrote these things out about his time in the Corps, but also after his passing, as I was looking around in his computer and finding bits and pieces of other things that he was writing, again, about his mother and his father and siblings and things like that. So there's firsthand accounts from him. And in the second half of the book, it's entirely exactly as my father wrote. But the other thing is, too, that I didn't have to try to remember what things were like, because when I was in high school, as a sophomore, we were tasked with keeping a journal. And like most 15-year-old boys, I thought, this is stupid. I don't want to do this. But there was so much going on, playing varsity football for the first time and dating a girl and my parents and their tumultuous relationship, that I wrote hundreds and hundreds of handwritten pages. So it's literally like when my parents had their final blow up and there was screaming and yelling and dishes breaking and things like that. I don't have to try to remember what it was like. I've got my words as a 15-year-old the next morning, what I wrote about that. The day that he moved out, I've got exactly what I was thinking as a 15-year-old, that dad moved out. I haven't seen him in 9 days. How's this going to affect me? So that's a very unique perspective, that there's firsthand accounts on both of our parts.
You mentioned the tumultuous relationship that he had with your mother. Can you describe, you go into fairly decent detail in the book. Can you describe a bit about sort of what was going on between the two of them and how they even got together and then even stayed together?
Yeah. They got married because my mom got pregnant. I mean, that's now I'm somebody who takes things at face value. To be truthful, I didn't even realize that till I was in my late teens. I never sat down and said, well, mom and dad were married here and Carrie was born here. Huh, that's not 9 months. It wasn't on my radar. I just didn't even think. Like, my sister's like, what? You didn't do the math? But so there they are, they're dating. She gets pregnant. They end up getting married. And so that's not a good way to start. And then you go into the Marine Corps, and he was down in Quantico. He was in officer candidate school. So very difficult. And then all of a sudden they move to Hawaii, and I'm born. So here's this 21-year-old with an infant and a toddler. And my dad's out running around, raising hell and doing stuff like that. And but also he had a temper. I mean, he had a real temper. And so I think between that and then bad relationship with his dad and going off to Vietnam and experiencing what he experienced there, when he got back, I'll just share a story that kind of encapsulates it. We had moved to California in 1969. We're living in Southern California. Dad had got a transfer out there. And his brother, Kevin, told me at his funeral, he said, you know what? He goes, yeah, I remember when you guys moved out there in 69, your dad got me an interview. He said, I flew out. He picks me up at the airport Friday afternoon. He said, we went straight to the bars, strip clubs, pool halls, slept on the beach, woke up. We did it all again. And he laughed. And he goes, I think we got to your house Sunday afternoon. And I said, Kevin, that's why mom was always so pissed. And he just kind of had a moment of clarity, and he's like, she had a right to be. But I think that was my dad's way of processing this bottled up anger, and nobody's talking about PTSD. So anyway, my mom is in the middle of this. I mean, she's the verbal punching bag, sometimes the physical punching bag. He's running around cheating on her. There's no way she's going to be in a position to help him deal with his demons. And so they would reconcile some, try to get things right. It would start to fall apart again. And so they just went through this pattern until my father met Joe, who he ended up being married to for 38 years. And I think that Joe, not being a part of all the tumultuous relationship thing, could just sit and listen. And he started like telling her things that he wouldn't tell anybody else. And that like let the air out of the balloon, and he began to change. And I really do think that he was faithful to her and a totally different individual, over the course of their marriage. But man, there was just no way my mom was going to be able to help him through that when she's getting the brunt of everything.
He went through a fair bit, I'm sure, of trauma growing up with his father. A lot of pressure, alcoholism, abuse, different things. Do you think that sort of started his path to this prior to even joining the Marine Corps?
Oh, absolutely. Because I think you don't realize it until you get older, but we are a product in great measure by how we're raised. And even when people say, I'm never going to be like you, it's amazing how often you still end up like that person, not just because of the genetics that you have, but because of just the time together. I can look at my sister, who did not have a very good relationship with my dad until the end. And I would see mannerisms in her, and I'm thinking, you only lived with him for maybe 10 years of your life, or something like that, when they weren't separated. And yet she has all these mannerisms. I'm sure she can look at me and say, wow, you have all these mannerisms. But what I talk about a lot in the book is how history repeats itself. And so, my grandfather's alcoholism repeated itself, not with my father. My father never got to a point where he needed to get into AA and life was unraveling and things like that. But he talked about the abuse that his father, was laying on his mother, and told him at one point, he goes, if you lay a hand on her, I'm going to effing kill you. And then my dad became that guy where he was being verbally and physically abusive at times with my mom. So even though he, I think, hated his dad, and a lot of the time, here he was repeating that behavior. And that happens so often. And I became very conscious of that, and really, and I write about this in the book, really made conscious choices to raise our daughter differently and not pass down the negative. Now, hopefully we'll get to the good, because I got so much good stuff from my dad, and I am so much of my success I owe to him and the things that he instilled in me. But those bad things, I wanted to make sure those things stopped. And so just raised our daughter in a very, very different way. And it was gratifying yesterday on Father's Day to be with her, and just to have her say at 28, she's like, I have loved my life, and I love the way that you raised me, and I want to raise my kids that way. So we did something right.
Absolutely. Yes, we will absolutely get to the good. I think it's good to lay the groundwork here, because I'm trying to understand so much about what you came up through and how you made that decision. Because something that you wrote in near the beginning of the book was, because you start the book with his passing, you sort of dip back and start to talk about a lot of the different traumas experienced, but you wrote something that really stuck out to me was, despite all of this, he was trying to be a good dad.
Yeah. It was interesting as I worked with one of my editors. Her name's Nancy, and I've known Nancy a long time, and she edited the other books that I did. And working with her wasn't just, hey, you misspelled this word or changed this phrase, but we would talk a lot about what was going on. And she made a comment. She goes, your dad was a shit husband, but it seemed like he was trying to be a good dad. Because as I reflected on the things where, he was taking me to see USC, UCLA, and USC Notre Dame, and we went and watched the Rams and certain other things that he did. I remember him taking me to watch the Washington Redskins back when they were the Redskins, and they were getting ready to play the Miami Dolphins in the Super Bowl, and took me to watch them to practice. So he was doing things to, I think, try to stay connected. He was always at practices if he could be. He was always at my ball games when I'm playing football or baseball and stuff. And so I think he really was trying to be a good dad in that sense.
He's trying to be involved.
Yeah, he wasn't the little league parent by any means. He was not like that, but he was always there. He was always supportive. We would talk about, my playing, but I never felt this pressure like we hear about today. But he was definitely, when he wasn't traveling, and he did travel a lot, he was definitely involved.
Writing a book like this, you had to do, like you said, a lot of reflection, and there has to be some bit of growth and really getting into the weeds of your own emotional state, reflecting on those raw memories, reading your old journals. How were you able to do that, process that, and then really get it down into a specific story?
The processing part, when you're growing up in it, you have no clue how it's affecting you. You just don't have enough life experience to look back and see patterns of who you are and where did those patterns come from. So an example that I wrote about in the book, when I was a junior in high school, and I'm in the library and I'm talking to somebody, and the librarian makes a comment about me talking. And of course, 17 years old, I say something, we get in this little back and forth. And she finally says, all you did was talk yesterday. And so I plead my case. I'm like, but I was talking to Mr. Bash, who was a teacher. She finally had had enough. And she goes, look, if you don't like it, leave. And I exploded. And I just go, fine, I don't give a damn. I'm going to get the hell out of here as loud as I could. And I stormed out the door. Well, she went out the other door and she confronted me and dragged me into an office. And she gave me every opportunity to apologize. And I wouldn't. I was just like, the hell with you. I'm not going to give you the satisfaction. And if you would have told me that, hey, I think this has to do with what's going on with your parents, I would have been like, no way, she's just a bitch. And I would have just gone off on that. As I look at those journals that I wrote, I was a pretty angry kid, even though on the surface I was, AB student, captain of the football team. I was, didn't mess around with drugs and things like that. So in one sense, I was a good kid, but man, stuff that would set me off and the words that I would write about situations and people and stuff, I was angry, but I had no frame of reference to go back and say, this is because my mom and dad are going through all this hell and dad's moved out of the house and all. I just couldn't put those pieces together. As I got older, I started putting those pieces together. And then it really came to a head when I was turning 30. And I'll defer on that story, Sean, in case you want to talk about it later. But once I started to deeply think about what had gone on in my parents' relationship, that's where I started feeling like I need answers and I need to start putting pieces together.
Let's dive back a bit first. What was your father's time like in Vietnam? And did he ever talk about it? Did you know anything about what he was going through?
No, I really did not until he started opening up a little bit in his late 60s and wrote the document and gave it to me. And then we started talking about some things. So no, up until that point, I had no idea about what he experienced. All I knew was he had been in the Marines. He had been over in Vietnam. And even as a little kid, when I would try to press him, you want to hear stories about soldiers and things, he wouldn't really say much at all. The only thing I can remember him saying is, maybe a machine gun barrel is glowing, almost glowing red. It's so hot from firing or something like that. But that's like one of the very few fragments I can remember of him talking about anything. And so I had no frame of reference about why he was the way he was, why he could be such a hard ass about certain things, why he would get so angry about things that wouldn't upset most people. I had no frame of reference, right? And if you don't have a frame of reference, it can be really easy to grow up and think, my dad's just an ass, and have no understanding or empathy for what he's been through and why he might be the way that he is.
Did that empathy start to grow when you read that document he wrote?
Yes, it started to grow at that point. It really, especially towards the end of his life, when I was reading Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score, really, that's where it dropped from my head to my heart, where I started having understanding like certain things that you go through in life and you can't talk about them or you can't express them in a normal way. And so I shouldn't say normal, but like some people, they'll get their expression out through art. And I think I put in the book that, I used to look at certain works of art and I would think whoever made that must be whacked. I mean, they must just be like out in left field. Now I have understanding that that person has probably been through experiences that there's just no other way for them to get out what they've been through or what has happened to them. And so that's their mode of expression. And as I started to understand that, that's where I really had empathy, where it dropped to my heart, because when I was reading that book, sometimes I would just stop and cry.
There's a particularly harrowing story in his journal that you include in the book, and it's one that just it really stops you in your tracks as you're reading it. And I don't know if you want to recount that story for us here.
Sure. So my dad, he told me this verbally, and then when he handed me the document, so we were already starting to talk, but I think he was piecing together this document and thinking about his life in Vietnam. But he had told me as an intelligence officer that there was a Viet Cong who had been gut shot, and it was apparent that the man was going to die. And it was a hot day, and it was out in the sun, and the South Vietnamese commanding officer is kicking this man, and he just said the brutality of it, he couldn't take it anymore. And so my dad, through the interpreter, told him to stop, and he wouldn't. And my dad pulled his revolver out and put it to his head and said, and I'm going to quote his words, "If you kick him again, I'll blow your fucking head off." And then he said the guy died in his arms under a tree. It's things like that that make you realize why somebody doesn't want to talk about it. But in the midst of all the bad stuff that had happened between he and my mom, and I questioned him on all of it. Why did you hit her? Why did you cheat on her? Why did you this? And I'm sure he thought, who the hell are you to question me about anything? But that story made me feel like Dad had not lost his moral compass. And I talked about that in his eulogy, which is at the back of the book, because even though he'd grown up Catholic and involved with church, he wanted nothing to do with church after he got back from Vietnam. He literally said, after what I saw, that crap can't be real. But what I equated it to is, the Bible says that while we were enemies, Christ died for us. And my dad was willing to put his military career and potentially his life on the line for somebody who was truly the enemy, because it was the right thing to do. That he didn't need to be brutalized in those last moments of his life. And I'm proud of my dad for that. And that just set a lot of things right for me, because I don't know if I would have had the guts to do that. I don't know what I would have been like if I'd been raised by an alcoholic dad, got a girl pregnant, all the things that he went through. I don't know how I would have responded. And for any of us to think we do, I think we're fooling ourselves. We will never know until we are in those situations.
You mentioned that was the dad you wanted to know.
Yeah, because who wouldn't be proud of somebody who would stand up and do that? And it also set in motion too that, as I was think back about things, my dad would always stand up for somebody if it was the right thing to do. It didn't matter. He was going to be that person who was going to step in and do something. Now, he had his own demons though, right? So he was doing a lot of bad things. But he would step in and do the right thing. He would help the person who needed help. And he did instill a really strong sense of right and wrong. And so in his own way, he might have been like me, where I said, I want these certain things to stop, and we're going to raise our daughter differently. And he might have thought, what, for all the things I've done, I want to make sure that my son, knows the difference between right and wrong. And he held me to account on that. And I'm very thankful for that.
How did you put aside your own anger in the desire to get to know him better?
It took getting angry at him to even start that process, because up until I was 30, it was all kind of fun and games. I was playing some golf back then. He was really into golf, and my wife and his wife were too. So, go play golf, have some beers, tell some jokes, have a nice meal. And I enjoyed that. And I enjoyed, time with him and Joe, and my wife, Jane, enjoyed the time too. But the incident that blew the lid off was on my 30th birthday. We had invited my father and his wife, Joe, to come down to Columbus. They lived about 45 minutes away for my birthday, and to go to church. And Joe said, I don't think your dad's going to want to go to church, and you might want to talk to him about that. So he called me one day and he goes, hey, Joe and I are going to come down for your birthday, and and then we're going to head home. And I said, really? I was hoping you'd go to church with us. I thought it was pretty non-threatening. It was Easter weekend. And he said, no, we're not going to be able to. And I said, why? And he goes, oh, no reason. He goes, just don't want to go. And I said, well, there has to be a reason. And he's like, no, there's no reason. I just don't want to go. And so we kind of had this like tug of war for a bit. And he goes, look, I'm at the airport. If you want to talk about it, I'll be home tomorrow. You can call me. Well, he didn't think I would, but I called him. I said, Dad, I want to talk about this. Why won't you come to church? And that's because my wife and I, our lives had really radically changed. Our marriage was being healed, and all these good things were going on. And we just wanted to share that with him and Joe. So we're having this conversation, and he says, look, there's no reasons. I just don't want to go. So as we kept talking, at some point he slipped and he goes, I have my reasons. And I said, well, what are they? And he goes, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, well, Dad, just a moment ago, you said we can talk open and honest about anything. I want to talk about this. And then all of a sudden he goes, look, I don't like the way, where he goes, I know more about goddamn religion than you'll know in your whole fucking life. And I don't care what anybody says. I'm not a bad person. I said, Dad, I've never said you're a bad person. He goes, oh, in so many ways you have. And then he goes, look, I don't like the way this conversation's going. And I said, well, that's another thing we have to talk about. Life doesn't always go the way you click. And he hung up. And Sean, it was as if at that point, all the stuff that I knew had happened in the marriage dropped into my heart. And I was like a volcano. I had every intent in getting in my car, making the 45-minute drive, and just tear him apart. And back then, I used to be a competitive bodybuilder. I was probably 225 pounds. I'm 5'9". But I will be honest, I'll bet my dad would have kicked my ass because he was just a tough SOB. My mom talked me off the ledge. But at that point, that's where everything changed. I could no longer just, go play some golf, have a few beers, tell some jokes, whatever. I wanted answers to these things that had gone on. And to his credit, he met me somewhere for dinner one night. And
how many years later?
It wasn't years. It was probably months later. Mm-hmm. And he could not understand why I wanted to revisit the past. And I said, Dad, what would you do if I hit Joe? That's his wife, who he was married to for 38 years. And for those of you who are in the Marines, I'm sure you can imagine the intensity of this. He leans across the table and he goes, I will fucking kill you if you ever touch her. And I said, what if it was 5 years ago? And he goes, I don't care. If I find out you touch her, I'm going to fucking kill you. And I said, good. Now you know how I feel about the divorce. Doesn't matter that it was 12 years ago. For me, it's right now, and I want to talk about it. And to his credit, he struggled through it. He gave me very surface answers, but he at least tried to answer. And we just had a really rocky time for probably 5 years or so. I didn't cut him off. He didn't cut me off, but it was still awkward. It wasn't like it had been. We were trying to get to a better place. I wasn't pressing him every time we got together, but I started to realize things like I couldn't remember ever telling Dad I loved him. And so I resolved to, I'm going to tell him I love him. And it was hard that first time because no time seemed like the right time. But I said it and he said it and we hugged, and I don't know, things started getting better. And we just got to a point where we were able to accept each other a lot more. I knew he was trying. I think he saw that I kind of backed off a little bit, and we were able to just kind of slowly keep coming together.
So different than the way things are now, because there are so many rifts with families, and it's so easy to just cut the cord, say, you go your way, I'll go my way. And in the book, you mentioned that your sister, her and your dad didn't talk for many years. And I've experienced that with my own dad. And I don't know if it's because the age that I hit, and maybe you experienced this as well, especially around this point, is you started to hold him to a higher standard.
I don't know if I would call it a higher standard. I mean, I had a pretty high standard for him when I was growing up, with the things that I shared. I guess the standard I was holding him to is being human being and letting me really get to know and understand him. Because again, I knew that who he was and how I was raised was going to impact my marriage. And we hadn't had our daughter yet. She came along a few years later, but would ultimately impact any children that we had. And I wanted to have some understanding on that. So it really was, getting him to just be more human, and not just this, dad and he's so good at everything he does and so successful and all these things. Like, no, just tell me about, why this happened or why you felt this way. And so that's, I think, where I was with it.
There's these moments that I feel like almost every parent and child come to where the child wants more answers and wants to understand these things more. And it's so much harder when the parent is guarded or doesn't want to. And I commend your dad in a lot of ways for being able to sit down and have these moments, despite even maybe giving sort of surface answers. The fact that he was even willing to face some of this.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, that has not been the case. And that drives even further of a wedge. And then you go back to the surface level because you know that diving any deeper than that, you're not getting anywhere. You're not furthering anything. And then you just sort of feel like, well, here we are. And that's our baseline. And that's what I have to come to accept. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So again, I give him all the credit in the world for the fact that he didn't just cut me off. He didn't really cut my sister off. I think she kind of cut him off, but he was like, well, the heck with it. I don't need her if she doesn't need me. And so I don't know, maybe he didn't want that to be the case also with his son. But for somebody who was so smart, he hadn't thought deeply about things, about why he was the way he was and the impact that his father might have had on him and how that then would impact the people around him. It was interesting that when my stepmom, Jo, read the first draft of the book, there were things that she learned that she didn't know. Like she had no idea. She was shocked that she learned that my dad had hit my mom, because she said, I never saw anything like that. But it explained something too, because she would see pictures of him when he was younger, and he and his brothers were a rowdy, fun-loving bunch of guys. And she made a comment once, and she said, "Gosh, I wish I knew you back then." And he just very matter-of-factly goes, "No, you don't," because he knew who he was, what he had done, and he just wanted to lock that away. And part of me doesn't blame him. It was to the point where when he got married to Jo in 1982, and I was down at Miami University, a couple hours away from Columbus, didn't have a car, wasn't going to go to the wedding, and he sent a friend down to pick me up. And as we're driving home, she tells me, she said, your dad is really happy that you're coming to the wedding, and he doesn't take this lightly. She said, we were up pretty late the other night having some drinks, and he asked me, do you think I'm going to go to hell for what I've done? So he knew he'd done a lot of bad stuff. And that Catholic upbringing, and he knew right and wrong. I think he believed there's a heaven and a hell, and he was wrestling with, am I one of those people who's going to go to hell? And that's why I said in the eulogy that that what he displayed with that Viet Cong guy who was shot, who died in his arms, that was a pivotal moment, I think, because again, I think that's the love of God, to extend help even to somebody who is an enemy. And I just wish I could have pointed that out to him while he was alive. I didn't really make that connection, but you start making a lot of connections when you're thinking about somebody and writing a eulogy. But I do think that every one of us, we've all done bad things, and some are worse than others, but nonetheless, we've all done bad things. And he was just more aware than most people of what his were, and wrestled with that. But that's why it was also so good to see, by the end of his life, all the things that he was doing and how much people loved him and how he was that helpful neighbor and all those things And my wife asked me at the funeral, she said, does it bother you that he wasn't really that way when you were growing up? And I said, no, it would have bothered me if he hadn't changed. I said, I'm happy to hear all these stories and how he would take kids fishing or whatever it was that he would do, that he was having a positive impact on people. And you know, we're all called to grow and change. And I hope my best days are my last days.
Was it, and Todd put it here in the chat about the body keeps the score, was it after that you read this, and as Todd put in here, the author came to his realization about trauma while working with veterans at the VA. What did you pull from that book that really helped you to understand your father's trauma?
It's 4 years ago now that I read it, and I haven't picked it back up since then. I was reading it just before he passed away, and that's where the unfinished letter in the book comes, because I sat down and started writing my dad about the book and how I wanted to talk to him, and didn't finish the letter, and then he passed away. What I remember of it, Sean, was the beginning was kind of heavily loaded, it seemed like, with PTSD and talking a lot about Vietnam vets. And so, of course, I can start making the connection there with my father. But it was that certain events are so difficult that our body either like tries to shut it down because it feels like it'll overwhelm or kill us, or we try to make the conscious choice to push it away and not think about it. But as the book describes, it's going to come out somehow, some way. And we can find a somewhat constructive way. It could be writing, it could be, you know, talking, counseling, art, whatever, to let the air out of that balloon so that you don't explode. And that is where, again, I would just have these pictures of my dad over in Vietnam, and what must it have been like for a 24-year-old to be going through, you know, jungles or, you know, firefights and things like that. I look at 24-year-olds now, I'm 60, and I'm like, man, they're just kids. I know they're adults, but they're just kids, let alone 18, 19-year-olds. And I don't know, my heart broke, and I just started having so much more empathy for him and for others who've been through that. I have somebody who, well, I'm not going to share other people's story, but I've talked with other people, and it's the same kind of thing where you're trying to process this thing was never in a million years on your radar as a human being. And all of a sudden you have been a part of it, and you don't know how to deal with that. It's not like going to the doctor for a cold and getting a prescription or something. And so again, I just began to have so much more empathy for him.
When he was in Vietnam, and I say the body keeps the score. There's a story about him flying through the air.
Yeah, he jumped out of a helicopter. He said before he could hear anything, there was an explosion, and he was flying through the air. And one of his buddies who got in touch after the funeral sent a story and said, yeah, we saw your dad get blown up. And he stood up, dusted himself off, saluted us, and started up the hill. And again, I mean, that makes me proud as hell.
What made me kind of smile, though, in that story is that he got kind of blown up there, very serious, but he stood up and he saluted. And I don't know why that was his first thought to then go up the hill, but he saluted first.
Yeah, that's what
to say, like, hey, I'm okay, or was it just sort of like you drilled into him, I guess?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that my dad was very gung-ho, and then after in the 70s, like a lot of guys, he wanted nothing to do with the Corps. And it wasn't until he met Joe that he was able to start attending some functions. I think all of that and what was happening with my mom, that marriage, all of that stuff together, it was eating away at him. But he was able to start talking about it, confiding in Jo, telling her things. He went to see the wall. He started going to some Marine Corps functions. And once he turned that corner back, I mean, he had the emblem on the license plate. It was on his auto signature. He flew the flag. He was 100% all in, and he loved this country. I mean, he with a passion.
Do you think that that acceptance of his past started the deflating that balloon, like that you talked, that, you know, we had this really tumultuous history with him, but at some point Joe and maybe this acceptance started to make him really see, like, be change, be different?
Yeah, I do. I think being able to have somebody who loved him unconditionally, who no matter what he unburdened himself, was still there and loved him with all their heart. I think that can certainly start opening people up to realize, hey, if there's one person who can love me like this, maybe there's other people too. Certainly my relationship was different with him because grew up and saw and some of the things that went on. But nonetheless, once I got past the anger, about the questions and the divorce and everything, yeah, I definitely loved my dad. It wasn't, a touchy-feely kind of relationship like I've got with my daughter where I'm hugging her all the time and things like that. But definitely loved him, and that admiration that I had came back. I was always proud to introduce him to friends.
I want to bring up some of the pictures that you had here of your dad in the Corps. He looks, is he 24 here?
He would be at least 20, yeah, at least 22. Because he went right out of college. He went directly into the Corps, so that was probably at age 22.
And was he what would you call heavy artillery? What was his job in the Corps?
Intelligence officer.
And these are pictures he took in Vietnam?
Yeah. Seeing those kids, he talked about going into a village one day and there was an American doctor and helping out. And then at night they hear commotion and guns and things. They went back the next day and a lot of adults have been killed. And one of the kids who'd been inoculated had their arm cut off to send a message. I mean, it was horrible stuff. That's the big guy on the left is Major Watson. He wrote about him quite a bit, and his impact on troops and my dad. Interesting individual.
Your dad's on the far right here?
Yes, and then on the far left, and I forget his name, but you remember the Gomer Pyle, USMC? That was the guy who was the sergeant so it was recruiting day in New York City.
Him in Vietnam and these are folds. They look like barbed wire, but these are folds in the photo.
Yeah. He probably had the picture taken and folded up and put it in his pocket. But that was, I think that was the day after a battle that they'd had, so nobody was in good spirits.
What do you see? What do you think when you see this picture?
The previous one or this one here? I guess the first word that comes to my mind is my dad. I thought was a badass, and I could definitely see him, getting blown up and getting back up and running up a hill. I don't know. I'm proud of him. I am proud that he served. He didn't get drafted. He volunteered. And he served because he loved this country. And I think being, son of, I forget how many generations there were. I think his family might have come over in the 1880s, but that's only 80 years or so that his family had been here. I think they were all proud to be Americans, and they, there was a call and they went with that call, and it was an honorable thing. So I'm incredibly proud of him.
Todd, you mentioned what was the thing on the left in the second picture? Let's see here. I think it was a tank one. This here?
Yes, and Brad Washawa answered ground radar. I thought it was a robot, personally, but ground radar. I want to ask more questions about that down the road.
Absolutely. Hold on one sec. We'll get back. This is his commendations.
Yeah, so he had that hanging in his office. And I made sure I grabbed a picture of it. It's still there. So Joe has all of his things except for his Marine Corps sword. She gave that to our daughter and her husband for their wedding. And here was I wish my dad had been alive for the wedding. He did get a chance to meet Tyler. So this is crazy, but our last name is Ahearn. And my daughter met a guy named Tyler Ahearn, spelled the same way. And they got married 2 years ago. So we only had one, a daughter. And I tell everybody, I gained a son. He's got my name. and my name will go on because she is still an Ahearn. And they did the 23andMe when they weren't dating and just thought it was funny that they had the same name. So they knew long before they ever started dating that there was no relation. Except, who knows, going back hundreds of years or something to Cork, Ireland, where my family originated from. But anyway, it was really cool that she went from Miss Ahearn to Mrs. Ahearn. And so for the wedding, Joe gave the Marine Corps sword to them.
It's a great picture of, I believe, your dad with his siblings.
Yeah, so Corny, the oldest brother, is not pictured there, but Kevin's got the funny hat on. There was Dennis. My dad was in the middle, Barry, and the youngest brother, Rory. And that picture encapsulates when those guys were together. It was just story after story, joke after joke. You could not be around them and not have fun. And the thing that was really cool was even after they'd all made their run through AA and nobody was drinking anymore, they were still every bit as much fun. The stories were still great. The jokes were funny. It was always a delight to be around them. And that was, that was shortly after they returned from Vietnam. So my mom's holding me. My sister's in the red tights there. The rest of the folks there are siblings. My dad's mother is on the far right in front of the Christmas tree. But his dad is not in the picture. That picture reminds me, if anybody is looking for a good movie, I believe it was on Netflix, either Netflix or Amazon, called The Mending Line. And I bet many of you have watched it. When I saw the opening scene in that movie, and the guy's fly fishing, and my dad loved fishing, I was like, oh my God, that is my dad. I mean, that character wasn't entirely him, but that was a pretty close proximity to my dad. Here was a guy who, just wanted to forget the past and fish and relax and try to enjoy life. But he had the goatee, man, he looked like my dad. And that was our daughter's wedding, which was 2 years ago this month. There's Tyler Ahearn on the left there, and our daughter and my wife, Jane. And I tell people it's been the best day of my life so far. I do think that when she says, hey, we're pregnant, that'll probably be an even better day.
Did it scare you after all of what you and your dad and his dad had been through to become a dad yourself?
No. Not at all, because
really, why?
In fact, I mentioned this to somebody today. I was over at the cigar shop doing a little work and talking with his name's Ishba, and I said, when Jane got pregnant and people were giving us, books like What to Expect When Expecting and all these books on parenting, I remember exactly where I was as I walked down the hall at work, and I just said, God, I'm not going to read any of those books, and I am going to trust that you're going to give me everything I need to raise this child. We didn't know if it was going to be a girl or not. And I don't know, something happened when she was born. I fell in love with her. I would get her up I'd go, I'm an early riser. I'd go into her room, get her out of the crib at 4 a.m. and go downstairs and read to her. Whenever I was doing chores, I'd have her in one arm and I'm doing stuff over here. Whenever I was going to go somewhere. Hey, Abigail, I'm going to go to the mall, get in the car. We would go do stuff. We got involved in father-daughter things. So my relationship with her was very different. Um, and it's funny because I was never around kids. I literally don't ever remember holding a baby until she was born. And I don't think I've held a baby since I held her. And I told her, I said, the next one I'll hold will be yours. But everything clicked for me, and I loved it. I still love being a dad. Even at 28, I'm still the dad, and she'll lean on me for some things, but it didn't make me fearful. And I will say that the biggest thing that was so helpful is because we were always doing things together. We might drive for an hour to go horseback riding. We might drive 4 hours to go spend the night in a cave or something. We were always talking, always. And that incident I mentioned about the high school and the librarian, I told her about that when she was somewhat young. And I would just tell her, I said, Abigail, sometimes things are going to happen in life and you're not going to know why you're doing what you're doing, but there's a reason. And, or when you're in high school and you see kids doing things you don't agree with, you just don't know what's going on with them. So give them some grace. So we would always have these conversations, and that's what made us so close. I almost can't think of anything that I've not talked to her about, good or bad.
We're going to take our station break here in a minute, but I wanted to get to the idea of faith, because you're a committed man of faith. And it reads that way in the book. You have a lot of biblical quotes in there, things that you've reflected on. What brought that out in your life? It didn't start necessarily at an early age, though, right?
I remember living in California and just having a sense that God is real and I'm going to be okay. I mean, literally, I had that sense, but it wasn't until my wife and I went through some really difficult marriage issues, and I realized, you know what? I can't change anybody. And I just cried out and said, God, I don't care what you do with her. Things have to be right between me and you. That's all I care about. And that's when everything started to change. And it was, for me, it was kind of a Damascus Road experience like Paul. I mean, I began to see God everywhere. I started having what people might term weird things happen. But I could never, ever deny the reality of God and his presence in this world and his activity in my life. And I really believe it started at that moment. I think God was sitting there going, oh, finally, now I can work with you. When you don't care about anything else but getting right with me, I can deal with this. And then as a result, my wife started to change too. And we changed together and we healed things. And it's been awesome. We just had our 36th anniversary in March.
Oh, wow. Congrats.
Thank you.
Do you think that some bit of that was, I can only imagine, and I know that I would never understand going up through a household that way, and what you're watching, and he's gone, he's here, what's going on between him and your mom, and what you might have been leaning on in those points for strength and for guidance and for, that influence that a dad gives you, or a parent,
For me, it was coaches. First of all, I had great friends too. I've always just had really good friends. But during those years in high school, head down, focus playing football and the impact that coaches have. I still, in fact, today I got an email from my high school, the head coach. Here we are more than 40 years later, and he just wrote a review on the book and posted it on Amazon. Literally got that today. And we communicate all the time, he and I. That's how much of an impact he had on me. But I think those coaches, and then when I got involved with weightlifting and some power lifters saw that I was serious, and these guys were many years older, but they took me under their wing and treated me like one of them. And again, I think that kept me on the straight and narrow. There was no time to go do anything else when I'm working out all the time. I'm playing football or I'm back in the gym working out. And I loved those things. And so I wasn't going to do anything that was going to get in the way of either playing ball or getting bigger and stronger and working out.
I think this is a good chance, Todd, to take our station break here.
Yes, and I will be in charge of the station break. But I want to say, Brian, I have nothing but admiration for you. you're the hero of the story in my eyes. I'm really grateful for your candor in talking about your own painful childhood and the painful relationship with your father, whom you admire yourself. Your eloquence is just amazing to me. If you can write as you speak, then this will be a great bestseller. And I thought after I want to open it up for questions and comments from the audience, I want to ask the audience to consider, and you to consider, Brian, how much the Marine Corps is part of this story. Is it incidental that your father was a Marine, or is there somehow is your father's violence, aggression? Did it come from the Marine Corps? Did the Marine Corps hurt your father or help your father? Because I think it's a complicated story. I'm getting the sense like that Marine sword is a double-edged sword.
Mhm.
And so I look forward to talking about that. But first, I do want to let people know this is the Veterans Breakfast Club. We have in-person events. We have online events like we're doing now. Our next in-person event is on Wednesday in Sewickley. Please join us if you can. It's at Christ Church Grove Farm. They very kindly open their doors to us. We have about 100 people signed up for this event. And this will be a little bit of a different event than we usually do. We have veterans share stories with the public, but we're going to spend a lot of time with one veteran in particular, one veteran we recently celebrated, and that's Warren Goss. You'll know that we saw Warren off on May 30th at Pittsburgh International Airport so he could go back for the 80th anniversary of Normandy. And we surprised him with a going away party at the airport. Boy, was that great. It was very well covered in the news. He made a lot of connections. I talked to him. If you know Warren, he's 99 years old, landed on Utah Beach ahead of the first wave, combat engineer, fought his way through Germany. He's kind of an ordinary character. And he's come to well over 100 Veterans Breakfast Club events. And he's a cherished, one of our cherished veterans, but he's ornery, man. I mean, he could give your dad a run for his money, Brian. And I said to Warren, and he's very outspoken, he's very opinionated. When he saw me at the airport, what the hell are you doing here? I said, Warren, you're going to meet some head of states, maybe. Like, be polite to them. And sure enough, here is the King of Denmark, and here is the Prime Minister of Denmark meeting Warren. I just hope that they didn't speak English. He did shake hands with Macron, who's the president of France. There he is. They had a nice interaction. I saw this video on social media, and Warren just absolutely loved every moment in Normandy. Loved being with other veterans. Loved being with the French people. He had some surprise reunions that he's going to talk about. So this is all to say, if you're available in Western Pennsylvania, if you could come to our breakfast at Christ Church Grove Farm on Wednesday, would love to have you. Warren will be there, and he'll be talking about what the trip to Normandy was like. We will be back here on Thursday night, June 20th. Many of you know that we cover on Thursday nights World War II. We tend to. And we're covering a story that is another kind of story of trauma of war. That is with the son of a man who was captured by the Germans, an airman, American airman, and interned at Buchenwald. I had never known that the U.S. actually had POWs at Buchenwald. Some airmen, about 60, were treated as war criminals, and they were put into Buchenwald. And I mean, they were treated as concentration camp, incarcerated people, not as prisoners of war entitled to rights. So this is a very painful story, another family story. We're going to be talking about that on Thursday night. And then a week from tonight, we're having Jack McLean, a wonderful writer, Vietnam Marine. He's been on before talking about Loon, if you remember that wonderful book, beautifully written book. Harvard graduate. He's one of the very few, Harvard graduates who served in Vietnam. He's coming back because he has a new memoir called Found. It's about healing from Vietnam. And I think it's something that Brian would relate to, and many of us here would relate to. We want to thank our sponsor, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. They've been sponsoring us for a long time. They are a nonprofit that is dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, to educating people about the hazards of tobacco, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out more about tobacco-free Adagio Health at tobacco-free.adagiohealth.org. And we want to thank UPMC for Life. We're doing more events with UPMC for Life. Just talked with them today about doing some events in the Harrisburg area. We're going to be doing some events, I think, in Lancaster and in Philadelphia. UPMC for Life can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life is plans designed for veterans by veterans that could save you money. And you could find out more about what they offer at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. That's upmc.com/Medicare. We publish a quarterly magazine, and this comes out, spring, summer, fall, winter. And our summer magazine is just to the printer. So you people will be getting it soon. Here it is. This is the first time we've ever devoted a whole issue to one aspect of one war, and that is the air war in World War II. I look back at our archives of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We've been having veterans share stories on our programs since 2008. And so we have thousands of veterans have shared thousands of stories. And in the early years, many of them were airmen. Many of them flew B-24s, B-29s, B-17s, and they had stories to share, and we recorded them. So what we've done is taken some of the stories that we've heard at these events, including Ed Cottrell's story, who's with us tonight, and we've put them in magazine form. We send this out to almost 10,000 households free of charge. Please do let us know if you would like to receive a copy. We're very happy to send you one. And then finally, we like to let people know that we have a survey, 2.5-minute survey that people could take to let us know how we're doing, how we could improve, and any kind of suggestions you have for guests and future topics. All right, back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Todd. And also, just to let everybody know, is that you all know that we probably restream this right now on Facebook and on YouTube. For those of you watching us on both of those social media platforms, thank you for joining us. But also, we take this live program and we chop it up, make it concise, and release it as an audio podcast. So if you miss one of our programs and you can't watch it on YouTube and you just want to throw it in your earbuds while you're walking the dog or you're out driving, you can do that. But you can check that out on any of the podcast platforms. Just look for Veterans Breakfast Club, look for the Scuttlebutt, and you should be able to find pretty much all of our recent programs, as well as our Thursday night Greatest Generation Live programs. Look up Veterans Breakfast Club, Greatest Generation Live, and you'll find all of Glenn's programs on your podcast platforms as well. And what I want to say, Brian, jumping back into your story and also opening up here in the chat, anybody raising your hand or ask a question or have a story about your own relationship with your dad, as we are, again, only a couple days removed here from Father's Day. Todd, I love that question before the break of Brian, how does the Marine Corps factor into this? And was it the double-edged sword that Todd had mentioned?
I think it heightened a lot of my father's characteristics that were already there. Probably being pretty aggressive. He talked a lot about, getting in bar fights, when he's in college and things like that. So it probably heightened that, but I think at the same time, it balanced it out with discipline too. Discipline that he was able to use in his career, and discipline that he taught me that has served me extremely well. So I think I think it's the double-edged sword. I think more than just the Marines, though, too, the experience of combat and what that does to a human being, all of that turmoil coming back. You throw in the mix again the alcoholic father who their relationship was so bad that even when my dad was doing really well in business, we're living here in Ohio. He just moved into a really nice home. His parents come out, and the relationship was so toxic that they cut it short. It was toxic with his father, and he flew home. And 6 months later, his dad was dead. And so I think all of that stuff, you just throw it in a pot and stir it around, and that was the recipe for who he became. But he always said, the proudest thing for him was being in the Marine Corps and leading men in combat. Nothing else, not even being married to Joe, not being a father, not being a son, a brother, nothing for him was as great as having been a Marine and leading men in combat.
Did you feel like in that way that you were sort of always trying to live up to an ideal or playing second fiddle?
A little bit. There's two things to that. First was, even as a youngster, I understood that when my dad met another Marine, it seemed like he was closer to that person than me, his own son. With what I do in the social sciences and influence, I understand it now. There's a principle called unity, and unity says that it's easier for us to say yes and to help people who are of us, of our tribe. Certainly family is one of the closest, right? We do things for family that we wouldn't do even for maybe our best friends. The Marine Corps is absolutely one of those groups too. And so it explained for me why he seemed so close. I mean, when I was younger, it was kind of put me off a little bit, like, oh, wait a minute, I'm your son. But now I understand. So again, I can have grace for that. The other thing, lost my train of thought there. So when you ask me again, what exactly did you ask in that, Sean?
I lost my train of thought.
I think it's very common. I know military families, and maybe this is me projecting stuff, but I've heard from our veterans that, children often have to compete with the branch of service that their parents have, because so much is demanded by military service, so much that branch of service becomes your family in a very real sense. I mean, on par with your actual biological family, and many times even surpassing it. And I think it is hard for children raised, I think, in that environment to kind of compete. We're never going to compete with the Army, never going to compete with the Marine Corps.
I never felt like I was competing with the Marine Corps. But there's a lot of pride in my family. Not just pride like, hey, I did a good job, but like pride like, the heck with you, I can outdo you in this.
Yeah.
And I think, and I write about this too, as sons growing up, you crave, you want your father to be proud of you. I think you want to hear, I'm proud of you, son, even more than you want to hear, I love you. You want that person to look at you and say, you did a great job, or you're doing things even I couldn't do. I never felt like that much with my dad, at least early on, because he had done a lot of stuff, right? And I don't think in his mind anything I would have done in life would have equated to being a Marine and leading men in combat. But I will tell you, there was always a little sense of rivalry, like, well, I want to do some things that Dad didn't do. And so as a competitive power lifter and bodybuilder, my dad was never into that. I'm a second degree black belt in Taekwondo. I ran the Boston Marathon. I've done a lot of things, physical things, because I loved physicality and stuff. When my dad retired, he dabbled in trying to have a consulting firm. It didn't work out. I've been a highly successful entrepreneur. So there are things that I've done that he did not do. And you just want that person to say, wow, I'm so proud of you. And again, that's a lesson I've learned. And so with our daughter, I'm constantly telling her how proud I am. And it may just be how she's handling a situation, with grace and maturity. But I make sure I tell her, I am so proud of you, because when I leave this earth, I want my daughter to be a far better person than I was. And I hope that her kids are far better than she is. If we're all doing that, if we're all trying to make those people in our lives better than we are, that's how the world gets better, one person at a time. It should never be a competition like, well, I don't want you to exceed, or, anything like that. And so I think there was a little bit of a rivalry there, because I know there was a rivalry with my dad and his father. So that was kind of a generational thing that was being passed down, but I cut the line on that one.
I want to invite people to comment, ask questions, raise their hand, wave the hand in front of the camera, or raise the electronic hand here if you'd like. It's such a Excuse me?
I saw Bob Mizwa raise his hand.
Oh, Bob. Okay. Hey, Bob, I haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you. Another Vietnam veteran here.
Yeah, it's just that I'm on the Western Allegheny Community Library Board of Directors, so I had to think naturally. I tried persuading them, let's end these Monday meetings because I'm missing some of my BBC because of this. Hurry up, let's get the meeting over. So, but I can relate to what Brian was saying. I tell people the best job I ever had was being a first platoon
Yep.
or first lieutenant platoon leader in Vietnam. I mean, we fought for 3 straight days on the Laotian border. That camaraderie and esprit de corps has never been equaled in any civilian job I've held. And it sticks with you. And I tell people, all of a sudden you're sitting in an airport, you got your hat on, and you look across, here's this other guy, and there's that wry smile, and he's looking at you saying, been there, done that too, son. And people who've never served in combat have no idea what it's like, but those that have, I'll tell you what, there is a bond.
Yeah.
It's there for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
The problem is, and like I said in previous discussions, I got drunker than I ever have been in my entire life. My last night in Vietnam, and I remember throwing my bag, all my BDUs and that. I went home with just one set of, and I left my baggage in Vietnam. And I think so many guys did not do that. And they bring it home, and it just eats away at them from the inside. And until they can overcome that, it creates problems. It creates problems. And I know, having sat down with some guys and just talked to them and get that crap out of them, almost like a father confessor in a confessional, and it's just the way it is. And I think it's been that way for many centuries. You have like the warrior class.
Yeah.
They've experienced something that most like my kids, they can't relate to that. I've tried telling them what that experience is with those, but it's very difficult because they haven't been through it.
Yeah. Bob, I want to say there was something that my dad wrote, and I just happen to have it here because I've used this quote when I've done some presentations, but he said, I still find Marine friendships the most rewarding of any, even if they were not from Vietnam. There's an invisible bond that joins us forever. If a Marine has a need, others will step in to help. It must be a carryover from being so close in such terrible times.
My dad served in World War II, and he spent 3 years in a German POW camp. And he was so happy when I came back from Vietnam because, he could relate to that. And there was just a certain bond I had with my father because of what he'd gone through and what I had gone through, And we'd talk about things, but like I said, there's this bond with veterans. It's just, it's there, what can I say?
Brian, we had a guest on a few weeks ago, Stu Blackwell, young Marine, who wrote a wonderful book about the culture of the infantry. And he argues that the Marine Corps is really, 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 really good at warrior training, at getting people to get in touch, I guess you'd say, with the really aggressive human instinct that we all have, and that most of us suppress and repress and deny. Marine Corps training is like, we gotta bring up this, aggression to make a Marine. But the Marine Corps training also gives Marines ideally tools to contain, control, and channel that aggression in a mature way. So it's almost as if, it's kind of playing with fire. I think of getting in touch with this really dangerous primal instinct, but controlling it. And I think I just can't help but think that that's helped your dad grow as a human being before he passed away. He never, he remained, he was that ethic was instilled in him, that morality was instilled, where he did begin to question himself and work on it. He never stopped working on himself.
Yeah, I think outlets for him, one was golf. He was just as intense about golf as he was anything else, and he wasn't very good when he started, but he regularly was shooting in the mid 70s. Whenever I played with him, 75, 76 was always like on his scorecard. When he started to slip a little bit in that, and he felt like I can't do this as well as I want, it was fishing, and that's when I think he really began to slow down. But golf allowed him just to be able to focus on something, and but fishing, I think, allowed him to relax and really begin to contemplate things. We all need those things, because you can't just say, I'm not going to get mad.
Yeah.
You can't help how you feel. It's like, how am I
Right.
going to deal with what I feel? And I remember a friend of mine, when I was wrestling with stuff, and he was a Christian counselor, and he said, you should probably take up running. Well, I was lifting weights. I'm like, I'm not going to run. I like lifting weights. I found that I really liked running. And now, given the chance to run or lift, I would go run anytime. There's the peacefulness of being outside, the whole body engaged. It can definitely let off steam and kind
Body
of
keeps, yeah.
recenter me.
Body keeps the score. And I'm so grateful that you brought that book up. It's such a wonderful and path-breaking book. And I think the main lesson is you can't think yourself out of these problems. You can't think your way into healthiness. It's a holistic body thing. And so things like, and I'm looking at Jerry Augustine, another one of our Army Vietnam veterans, bodybuilder on the Zoom room, big time. He would tell you that, lifting weights, bodybuilding training helped heal him from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a whole body, trauma is a whole body experience.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that right, Jerry?
Yes, and I became Mr. New England. I really got into it when I came out of combat. I had to be the best at something when I came home, and I trained for 8 years until I finally won Mr. New England and Mr. Northeastern America. And after that, PTSD hit me pretty hard. Later on in life, I gave up medications from the VA, and I became a competitive runner for 17 years. And I actually won the Empire State Building run-up for the 50s division in 2001 at 55 years old. I never stopped.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. Not that I had PTSD, but that competitive outlet, and for me, when I started running, that was kind of new. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I can actually run fast and I can run far, and set a goal to run Boston. I qualified. I got to run it a few times, and then got involved with martial arts with my daughter and found out I was fairly good at that. But I just wanted that competitive outlet. I didn't want to just do something. And when people would meet me and I would say, well, I'm the son of a Marine, they go, okay, that explains a lot why
Yes.
why you get so intense about certain things. It's like I can block everything out and get so intently focused on whatever's in front of me. And that's served me really, really well as an entrepreneur.
Sue Watson, you correct me if I'm wrong, you were the daughter of a Marine, correct?
That's correct.
Does what Brian said speak to you as well?
You know what? It brings back a whole bunch of different things and things that I've sorted through. My dad's childhood was very different than most. He grew up in a Catholic orphanage. And so when he enlisted in the Marine Corps, it's a little bit different kind of experience, horrible hand-to-hand combat. But he came back from the Marines with two things he didn't have growing up. And I think that was a sense of camaraderie and people caring about him. And believe it or not, religion. He didn't have religion in a Catholic orphanage. It was a horrible experience, but he learned how to pray when he was on Iwo Jima. So he came back with that. I think, Todd knows two of the stories that are very significant to him. And when Bob Miswa talks about throwing the bag, my dad in a hand-to-hand combat situation, just completely exhausted, knew he had to get up or be killed, and came face to face with the enemy, and they both looked at one another and walked away. And another, the last day that he was there, he looked down at his very grisly bayonet, tried to clean it, and left it in the sand. And I think those two actions you know, I came to realize in life were so significant, in him being able to make a separation between what he saw and what he had to do and leaving it there. But the body keeps the score. I poured into that book, unfortunately, after my father had passed, but he really just, it was back pain that took his life away.
Yeah. Yes.
And the pain that he lived with. And I
Oh.
really believe that was the silent struggles that he lived with. It's, you know, his whole life. Todd was a huge key in helping him unlock some of that, but that, you know, it was late in life to do that.
Sue, I'm trying to hold it together. Your father, Jack Watson, was one of my all-time heroes, and Marine hand-to-hand combat Iwo Jima. Was able to find the courage very late in life to talk about that experience, and not just talk about it on camera, talk about it to hundreds of people at an event. And he's somebody who I think when he died, he was more spiritually advanced than, you know, just a few years earlier. I just get the sense that he did experience healing in his 90s.
I agree.
Oh,
I agree. It's
what a
like,
man.
yeah, yeah, that was a gift.
You know, I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:31. We have a program scheduled for July 22nd, Sue and Brian. It's going to focus on intergenerational trauma. I do think this is a real thing, and not just, of course, in military families or not just in children of veterans, of, you know, war veterans, but everywhere. That trauma does get passed down. It gets kind of like generated and expressed differently, maybe in the second generation or third generation. So we're going to have a neuroscientist on talking about that phenomenon. We're going to have some children of veterans who've written books. Hopefully, Brian will be able to join us. I think you might be busy that night, but maybe you might be able to join us, Brian. I can't quite remember. And Sue, I hope you'll join us too. I think this will be an important conversation. This will be Monday, July 22nd.
Thank you.
And I know Mary put into the chat that is the book The Body Keeps a Score. Is that good for a non-veteran who suffers from depression?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It was simply inspired by his work with veterans, but it's not, it covers all people. Yes.
Well, Brian, I know that we're coming up to the end of the program here. I want to thank you for your time, but I also want to say, is there any parting words about your father that you'd like to leave us with?
I would just, you know, we focused a lot early on about a lot of the negative things, the relationship with my mom and how that fell apart and everything. But, you know, the passage of time and working to reconcile, I tell people the book, I say it's about faith, grace, and reconciliation. And he and I reconciled in being able to do that. That also allowed me to move beyond just the bad things, to say, you know what, those bad things were right here. But once I got beyond them and out here, so many good things in terms of having been raised by him, you know, the discipline, learning the right from wrong, being faithful to the things that I do, all of those things, even if he fell short in them, he was trying to instill them in me. And that's been a benefit for my wife, my daughter, friends, my employers, and things like that. So I owe a lot. I am not self-made person. I am who I am in large part because of him. And I would just encourage people, if they have a difficult relationship with a parent like that, to try to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Thank you, Brian. And for those of you joining us, the book is His Story, My Story, Our Story. You can get this wherever books are sold. Is there Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Brian?
Yep, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Books A Million.
Well, thank you, Brian, again. And we do hope that you join us in a month for that follow-up sort of conversation that I think wraps nicely into this. Coming into the chat, just wonderful presentations, time well spent tonight. So I think everyone was definitely affected by this story and really listened in intently. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Again, we have a Wednesday morning in-person breakfast coming up. Thursday evening, we're going to be back again. Always back next Monday for another Scuttlebutt. So we hope to see you all again. Todd, any parting words?
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Take
Good night,
care.
everybody.